My wife said, "I don't want your last name anymore. My new lover says you're a loser and I should take a real man's name." My wife beamed. I said nothing. I calmly took out a pen and said, "Fine, sign here." A week later, our family's estate lawyer called her, his voice shaking. "Ma'am, do you realize what you just let him sign away?" You know what they say about family dinners. They're like Russian roulette, except instead of bullets, you get passive-aggressive comments about your life choices and someone's drunk uncle making inappropriate jokes. But tonight? Tonight was going to be special. I could feel it in my bones, the same way you can sense a thunderstorm coming or when your ex is about to text you at 2 a.m. The Cross family's grand dining hall was doing its usual thing, being ridiculously over the top. I'm talking chandeliers that probably cost more than most people's cars, crystal glasses that sparkled like they were auditioning for a role in a Disney movie, and enough polished silverware to blind a small aircraft. The whole setup screamed, "We have money and we're not afraid to show it." Which, let's be honest, was pretty much the Cross family motto. My relatives were scattered around the mahogany table like pieces on a chessboard, all of them doing that thing wealthy people do where they murmur appreciatively about absolutely nothing. "Oh, the salmon is divine," Aunt Margaret was saying, as if the fish had personally performed Shakespeare for her. Cousin Robert was nodding sagely at the wine selection like he was some kind of sommelier instead of a guy who inherited a trust fund and calls it a career. And there, at the head of it all, was Elellanar. My wife. Well, technically still my wife, but you know how technicalities work in marriages. They're about as reliable as a chocolate teapot. She was absolutely glowing tonight, practically vibrating with that special kind of energy people get when they're about to drop a bomb on your life. You know the look, like a cat that's caught a particularly juicy mouse and can't wait to play with it. Elellanar had always been a performer. Hell, that's probably what attracted me to her in the first place. Back when I was young and stupid enough to think drama was the same thing as passion. She lived for moments like this, when all eyes were on her, when she could command a room full of people who had more money than sense. Tonight, she was practically glowing under the attention, soaking it up like a sponge soaks up spilled wine. I should have seen it coming. The signs were all there. The way she'd been checking her phone constantly. The mysterious phone calls she'd take in another room. The sudden interest in finding herself and discovering her true worth. But you know how it is when you're married to someone for years. You start to tune out the warning signals the same way you tune out car alarms at 3 a.m. The conversation was flowing like cheap wine at a college party. Fast, and with questionable judgment. Cousin Julia was going on about her latest charity project, because apparently buying a third vacation home isn't enough to fill the void, while Uncle Martin was explaining his new business venture with the enthusiasm of someone who's never had to actually work for money. Standard rich people dinner conversation, in other words. That's when Elellanar decided to drop her little truth bomb. She stood up, and let me tell you, when Elellanar stands up at a dinner party, it's like watching a peacock spread its feathers. All calculated grace and deliberate drama. She reached for her wine glass with the kind of flourish usually reserved for Broadway productions, and I knew right then that whatever was coming next was going to be a doozy. "I have an announcement to make," she said, her voice carrying across the room like she was addressing the United Nations instead of a bunch of relatives who were probably more interested in the dessert course. The murmuring stopped. Forks paused midway to mouths. Even Aunt Margaret's perpetual commentary about the food died on her lips. Ellanar's smile could have powered the entire eastern seaboard. It was sharp, predatory, and absolutely triumphant. "I don't want your last name anymore. Now, I've been to a lot of awkward dinner parties in my time. I've sat through Uncle Harold's conspiracy theories about the Federal Reserve, Cousin Patricia's detailed descriptions of her various medical procedures, and that infamous Christmas dinner where Grandma Alice got drunk and told everyone exactly what she thought about their life choices. But this? This was entering uncharted territory. The silence that followed was the kind you usually only hear in libraries or funeral homes. Thick, heavy, and loaded with the promise of upcoming disaster. You could practically hear people's minds racing, trying to process what they'd just heard. Was this a joke? A performance art piece? A nervous breakdown disguised as a dinner announcement? But Elellanar wasn't done. Oh no, she was just getting warmed up. "My new lover says you're all a bunch of losers," she continued, her voice growing stronger with each word, feeding off the shocked silence like some kind of emotional vampire. "And I should take a real man's name instead of being tied to this." She gestured around the room with her wine glass, encompassing the chandelier, the artwork, the centuries of family history hanging on the walls. This pathetic legacy of entitled mediocrity. If the silence before had been thick, now it was practically solid. You could have cut it with a knife and served it as the main course. Gasps rippled across the room like waves in a disturbed pond. Some of the cousins. The younger ones who still thought family drama was entertaining rather than exhausting, let out nervous laughs, the kind people make when they're not sure if they're witnessing comedy or tragedy. And there, leaning against the wall like he owned the place, which, considering his ego, he probably thought he did, was Victor Hale, Eleanor's new lover and the apparent mastermind behind tonight's performance. The guy looked like he'd stepped out of a tech bro magazine. All perfectly styled hair, expensive casual wear, and teeth so white they could have been seen from orbit. His smile was pure smugness, the kind that made you want to check if your wallet was still in your pocket. Victor had that particular brand of arrogance that comes from making money in tech, and thinking it makes you better than people who inherited their wealth. As if new money was somehow morally superior to old money, when really it's all just numbers in a bank account at the end of the day. But there he was, practically preening as Eleanor delivered her little speech, like he was watching his protege perform at a recital. The whole room was staring at me now, waiting for my reaction. Some looked sympathetic, others curious, a few seemed downright excited to see how this particular soap opera was going to unfold. Uncle Martin had that look people get when they're watching a car accident. Horrified but unable to look away. Cousin Robert was already reaching for his phone, probably planning to live tweet the whole thing. But here's the thing about being publicly humiliated by someone you've shared a bed with for years. After the initial shock wears off, what you're mostly left with is a profound sense of relief. Like when you finally pull off a band-aid that's been bothering you for weeks. Yeah, it stings for a second, but mostly you're just glad the anticipation is over. I didn't shout. I didn't argue. I didn't even raise my voice. Instead, I did something that apparently nobody, including Eleanor, was expecting. I reached into my jacket pocket, pulled out a folded envelope and a pen, and placed them calmly on the table in front of her. "Fine," I said, my voice as steady as a surgeon's hand. "Sign here." The look on Eleanor's face was priceless. Pure confusion mixed with a dash of panic, like she'd been expecting fireworks and got a polite golf clap instead. She glanced over at Victor, who was still smirking but with a little less confidence now, probably wondering if this was part of some elaborate counter-performance. What is this?" Eleanor asked, but she was already reaching for the pen. Because that's the thing about Eleanor. She never could resist being the center of attention, even when she didn't understand what was happening. "Exactly what you asked for," I replied. "Freedom from the cross name." Eleanor looked at the document for maybe 3 seconds. About as long as she usually spent considering the consequences of her actions, before she scribbled her signature across the bottom with a flourish that would have made John Hancock proud. She was showing off for Victor, for the room, for everyone except the one person who actually mattered, herself. The moment her pen left the paper, the whispers started. They spread across the room like wildfire, relative to relative, each person adding their own commentary to the mix. Did she really just? Is that legal? What does this mean for the trust? Someone should call Harold. But I was already standing up, already walking away from the table, from Eleanor, from the whole ridiculous circus. I had what I needed, and Eleanor had exactly what she'd asked for. Sometimes the best revenge isn't a dish served cold. It's a dish the other person orders for themselves without reading the ingredients. As I reached the door, I could hear Eleanor behind me, her voice rising with confusion and the first hints of panic. "Adrien? Adrien, what did I just sign? What was that?" But I was already gone, walking out into the night air with my hands in my pockets and a weight I hadn't even realized I'd been carrying finally lifted from my shoulders. Because sometimes, when someone tells you exactly who they are, the smartest thing you can do is believe them. And Eleanor had just told me everything I needed to know. You know what's funny about revenge? Everyone thinks it's supposed to be hot. All fire and brimstone, dramatic confrontations, and shouting matches that end with someone throwing a drink in someone else's face. But the best revenge? That's cold as a Wisconsin winter and twice as brutal. It's the kind that sits quietly in a filing cabinet for years, waiting for exactly the right moment to remind someone that actions have consequences. I was sitting in my study now, 3 fingers of Macallan 25 warming in my hand, watching the amber liquid catch the light from the fireplace. The Scotch cost more than most people make in a month, but tonight it felt like the cheapest therapy session I'd ever bought. The silence in the house was absolute. No more Eleanor chattering on her phone. No more reality TV blaring from the living room. No more of her friends showing up unannounced to drink my wine and gossip about people whose only crime was having less money than they did. Peace and quiet. Who knew it could be so damn expensive? The Cross family charter was sitting on my desk like an old friend who'd finally decided to visit. Leather-bound, thick as a phone book, and about as exciting to read as tax code, unless you knew what to look for. Most people would flip through it and see nothing but legal jargon and dusty family history. But me? I saw it for what it really was. A masterpiece of long-term planning disguised as a boring document. My grandfather, Edmund Cross, had drafted this thing right after World War II, when he came back from Europe with a Purple Heart, a Bronze Star, and a very clear understanding of how quickly everything you think is permanent can disappear. He'd seen entire family fortunes wiped out overnight. Ancient bloodlines reduced to refugees with nothing but the clothes on their backs. So when he got home and started building the Cross Empire from a small construction company into what it is today, he made damn sure it would survive whatever stupidity future generations might inflict upon it. Edmund Cross was the kind of man who planned for every contingency, including the possibility that one day, some entitled descendant might decide the family name wasn't good enough for them. He called it bloodline insurance, though the lawyers preferred terms like heritage preservation clauses and legacy protection protocols. Same thing, really, just with more billable hours attached. I flipped through the pages, past the founding principles, a cross stands by their word and their name, past the investment strategies, diversified enough to survive another Great Depression, past the charitable giving requirements, because Edmund believed wealth without purpose was just hoarding with better tax lawyers. There it was, buried on page 247 like a landmine in a field of daisies. Clause 19.7, Voluntary Name Severance. The language was beautiful in its simplicity. No loopholes, no wiggle room. No, unless circumstances dictate otherwise, nonsense that modern lawyers love to stuff into contracts. Just clean, precise legalese that would have made my grandfather proud. Any individual who voluntarily and publicly renounces the Cross family name shall thereby forfeit all rights, privileges, and benefits derived from said name, including but not limited to trust distributions, property access, inheritance rights, and ceremonial participation in family affairs. But here's the thing about old legal documents. Sometimes they need a little updating to stay relevant. The world changes, people get more creative in their stupidity, and what seemed bulletproof in 1947 might have a few chinks in the armor by the 21st century. That's where Harold Linwood came in. Harold had been the Cross family attorney for longer than I'd been alive. One of those guys who wore three-piece suits even in summer and could recite contract law like poetry. When I'd started noticing Eleanor's, let's call them attitude adjustments, toward the family name about 3 years ago, I'd paid Harold a visit. Nothing dramatic, just a casual conversation about estate planning and legacy protection. Just hypothetically, I'd said, settling into the leather chair across from his desk, what would happen if someone decided they didn't want to be a Cross anymore? Harold had looked at me over his reading glasses with the expression of a man who'd seen every kind of family drama imaginable. Hypothetically, they'd lose everything. The original clause is ironclad. But what if they tried to fight it? What if they claimed they were coerced? Or they didn't understand what they were signing? That's when Harold had smiled. Not his usual polite attorney smile, but the kind of grin a chess master gets when they see checkmate coming in 3 moves. That's why we updated it, Mr. Cross. Remember? We added the public declaration requirement and the witness verification protocols. If someone voluntarily renounces the name in front of multiple witnesses, there's no claiming coercion. If they do it publicly, there's no claiming misunderstanding. And if they sign the documentation, he'd shrugged. Well, that's what we call a hat trick in legal circles. I thought I was being paranoid at the time. Eleanor had just started making those little comments about how stuffy and old-fashioned the Cross family was, how she felt constrained by all the tradition and expectation. I told myself it was just a phase, the kind of thing that happens when people hit their 30s and start questioning everything. But then the comments got sharper, more frequent. She started forgetting to wear her wedding ring, started introducing herself by her maiden name at social events, started talking about how she wanted to find her own identity outside of being Mrs. Cross. The writing wasn't just on the wall, it was in neon letters with flashing arrows. So I'd asked Harold to modernize Clause 19.7. To make it bulletproof against the kind of challenges a clever divorce attorney might throw at it. We'd spent months crafting the perfect language, consulting with estate specialists and family law experts, making sure every possible loophole was sewn shut tighter than a Navy submarine. The updated clause was a thing of beauty. Public declaration? Check. Eleanor had made her announcement in front of 24 family members and Victor's smartphone camera. Witness verification? Check. Half the Philadelphia Social Register had been sitting at that table. Written documentation? Check. Her signature was still drying on the paper upstairs. Voluntary action? Double check. Nobody had held a gun to her head and made her stand up and trash the family name in front of God and everybody. But the real genius of the clause wasn't in what it said, it was in what it didn't say. Most people, when they think about losing access to family money, imagine dramatic stuff. Being cut out of the will, losing their trust fund, Having their credit cards cancelled. Basic, obvious consequences that any decent lawyer could see coming from a mile away. What they don't think about are all the little things that make life comfortable when you're part of a wealthy family. The concierge service that handles your travel arrangements. The family foundation that covers your healthcare premiums. The property management company that maintains your car, handles your insurance, takes care of all those tedious adult responsibilities that rich people pay other people to worry about. They don't think about the social access, the club memberships, the charity board positions, the invitations to events where the real business gets done. They don't consider the professional networks, the family connections that open doors and smooth paths and make life generally easier for people with the right last name. And they definitely don't think about the ceremonial stuff. The burial plots in the family mausoleum, the portraits in the family gallery, the little brass nameplate that reserves your seat at the family table for major holidays and celebrations. All of it tied to one simple thing, the name. I tried to explain this to Eleanor once, about 2 years ago when she was going through one of her more than just a cross wife phases. We'd been at some charity gala and she'd been complaining about how people only talked to her because of my family name, how she wanted to be recognized for who she was as a person. You know what the name really is? I'd said, it's infrastructure, like plumbing or electricity. You don't notice it when it's working, but you sure as hell notice when it's not. She'd rolled her eyes and called me dramatic. It's just a name, Adrien. It's not like it actually does anything. And that, right there, was the moment I knew she'd never really understood what she'd married into. She thought the cross name was like a designer handbag, something flashy to show off at parties, but ultimately, just for decoration. She had no idea it was more like the foundation of a building, invisible most of the time, but holding up everything else. For years, I'd been watching her slowly distance herself from that foundation. The little slights, the casual dismissals, the way she'd forget to mention she was a cross when meeting new people. Each incident was small enough to ignore on its own, but together they painted a pretty clear picture of someone who'd never really wanted to be part of the family in the first place. And honestly, that was fine. The Cross family had survived wars, depressions, market crashes, and 3 generations of relatives who thought they were smarter than the system. We'd outlasted robber barons, political scandals, and that embarrassing decade in the 70s when Uncle Theodore decided he was going to be a rock star. We'd certainly survive Eleanor's little rebellion. What I hadn't expected was for her to make it so damn easy. When she'd stood up at that dinner table tonight and publicly renounced the name, she'd basically handed me a gift-wrap solution to a problem I'd been worrying about for years. No messy divorce proceedings, no custody battles over assets, no lengthy court fights about who was entitled to what. Just a clean, legal severance that she'd initiated herself, in front of witnesses, with full awareness of what she was doing. Well, maybe not full awareness. Eleanor had never been great with details. I took another sip of the Macallan and felt it burn warm down my throat. Tomorrow, Harold would start the paperwork to officially activate Clause 19.7. The family office would begin updating their systems, removing Eleanor's access from accounts and properties and services. The foundation would strike her name from the approved beneficiary list. The property management company would change the locks on the houses she'd never bothered to appreciate. It wouldn't happen all at once. That would be too obvious, too dramatic. Instead, it would be gradual, like watching a slow-motion avalanche. First the little things, then the bigger ones. Until Eleanor woke up one day and realized that everything she'd taken for granted had quietly disappeared. But that was tomorrow's problem. Tonight was for enjoying the silence, the Scotch, and the profound satisfaction that comes from watching someone get exactly what they asked for. You know what's beautiful about well-oiled machinery? It doesn't need you to stand there and cheer it on. It just works. And the Cross family legal apparatus was a thing of beauty, a Swiss watch made of contracts and clauses that had been ticking along perfectly for 3 generations. All it had needed was someone to wind it up, and Eleanor had done that herself when she'd signed that document with all the careful consideration of someone choosing a Netflix show. I was in my office at Cross Industries, pretending to review quarterly reports while actually enjoying the kind of deep, satisfying anticipation you get when you know something spectacular is about to happen and you're the only one who sees it coming. It's like watching someone walk toward a banana peel in slow motion. You want to warn them, but you also kind of want to see if they're really going to be that oblivious. My assistant, Janet, buzzed in around 10.30. Mr. Cross, Harold Linwood, is online too. He sounds agitated. Janet had been with Cross Industries for 15 years, which meant she'd developed that particular skill that good assistants have, the ability to communicate volumes with a single word choice. When Janet said Harold sounded agitated, what she meant was that our normally unflappable family attorney was probably somewhere between mild panic and full-scale nervous breakdown. Put him through. I said, settling back in my chair. This was going to be good. Harold's voice came through the speaker with the kind of barely controlled hysteria usually reserved for air traffic controllers during emergencies. Adrien? Adrien, we have a situation. Do we? I asked, injecting just enough innocent curiosity into my voice to probably drive Harold's blood pressure up another 10 points. What kind of situation? The kind where your wife, your estranged wife, just hung up on me after I tried to explain what she actually signed last night. Harold's breathing was audible through the phone, quick and shallow like he'd been running a marathon. Adrien, please tell me she understood what that document was. She understood that she wanted to reject the cross name. I replied calmly. I gave her exactly what she asked for. There was a long pause, the kind that in legal circles usually precedes either very good news or very bad news. In this case, I was pretty sure it was both, depending on your perspective. Adrien, Harold said finally, his voice dropping to the tone lawyers use when they're about to explain why your brilliant idea is actually going to land you in federal prison. Do you have any idea what you've done? I've honored my wife's clearly stated wishes, I said. She wanted freedom from the cross name. She got it. She got more than freedom, Harold said, and I could hear papers rustling in the background. Harold always rustled papers when he was nervous. It was like a legal tic. She got complete severance. Total separation. Absolute disconnection from everything, and I mean everything, associated with the Cross family. I waited, letting Harold work up to his point. One thing I'd learned from years of dealing with lawyers is that they need to build their arguments like they're constructing a cathedral, stone by stone, with lots of dramatic pauses for effect. The automated systems triggered this morning, Harold continued. All of them. Simultaneously. It's like watching dominoes fall, Adrien. Account access, property rights, insurance coverage, investment portfolios, trust distributions, everything tied to her status as Eleanor Cross just stopped. Stopped how? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Completely, Harold said, his voice rising again. Her credit cards were cancelled. Her health insurance was terminated. Her credit cards were cancelled. Her health insurance was terminated. Her access to the family accounts was revoked. The trust that's been covering her personal expenses? Frozen. The stock dividends that have been going to her personal account? Redirected back to the family fund. The property access codes? Changed. Even her membership in the Cross Foundation board was automatically revoked. I had to admit, Grandpa Edmund's system was even more thorough than I'd remembered. The old man had really thought of everything. And that's just the financial stuff, Harold continued, hitting his stride now. She's lost access to the family healthcare network, which includes some of the best specialists in the country. The travel accounts that covered her vacations gone, the household staff allowances terminated, the charitable foundation that's been funding her various projects cut off, even her parking space at the country club is technically invalid now because it was registered under the Cross family membership. Sounds comprehensive, I observed. Comprehensive, Harold's voice cracked slightly. Registered under the Cross family membership. Sounds comprehensive, I observed. Comprehensive. Harold's voice cracked slightly. Adrien, she can't even get into the family mausoleum anymore. The burial rights are tied to the name. If she dies tomorrow, she'd have to find somewhere else to be buried. I couldn't help it. I laughed. Harold, I don't think Eleanor's planning on dying anytime soon. That's not the point. Harold practically shouted, which was the emotional equivalent of Janet doing backflips. Harold never raised his voice. The point is that she signed away everything. Literally everything. And she had no idea what she was doing. She had every idea what she was doing. I corrected. She wanted to publicly humiliate me and reject the Cross name. Mission accomplished. But she didn't understand the consequences. That's not my problem, Harold. That's her problem. There was another pause, longer this time. I could almost hear Harold's legal mind churning through possibilities, looking for loopholes, escape clauses, anything that might undo what Eleanor had done to herself. Adrien, he said finally, his voice softer now, more careful. She called me this morning. At 6 a.m. She was, frantic doesn't begin to cover it. She tried to use her credit card for coffee, and it was declined. Then she tried to access her online banking, and couldn't get in. Then she tried to call the family accountant, and was told her access had been revoked. Sounds like a rough morning. She thought it was a mistake, Harold continued. Some kind of technical glitch or computer error. She actually laughed when I first started explaining what had happened. She thought it was funny. And now? Now she's sitting in her car outside Victor Hale's apartment building, calling me every 15 minutes demanding that I fix this. She keeps saying she didn't mean for it to be real, that it was supposed to be symbolic, That she never intended to actually give up anything. I leaned back in my chair, savoring the moment. This was better than I'd hoped. Elellanar hadn't just underestimated the consequences. She'd completely missed the fact that there would be consequences at all. What exactly did you tell her, Harold? The truth, Harold said miserably. That she voluntarily triggered Clause 19.7 of the Cross Family Charter. That her signature constituted legal renunciation of all rights, privileges, and benefits associated with the Cross name. That the document she signed wasn't symbolic or ceremonial. It was a binding legal instrument that immediately and permanently severed her connection to the Cross family estate. And how did she respond to that? She hung up on me. Twice. The third time she called back, she was crying. She kept saying I didn't know, over and over again. But she did know, I said quietly. She knew exactly what she was doing. She was choosing Victor Hale over me. She was choosing her new life over her old one. She was choosing to reject the Cross name because she thought it was holding her back from her true potential. Adrien, she's your wife. Was my wife. She made that very clear last night. This is going to destroy her, Harold said, and for the first time, his voice carried something other than legal concern. It sounded almost like sympathy. No, I corrected. This is going to reveal her. There's a difference. Harold was quiet for a moment, probably contemplating the ethical implications of what he'd helped facilitate. Harold was a good lawyer, which meant he understood that the law wasn't always fair, but it was always precise. Elellanar had signed a legal document, and legal documents had legal consequences. The fact that she hadn't bothered to understand those consequences before signing was unfortunate, but it wasn't Harold's fault, and it sure as hell wasn't mine. She wants to contest it, Harold said finally. She's talking about fraud, coercion, emotional duress. She thinks she can claim she wasn't in her right mind when she signed. Was she drunk? No. Under the influence of any controlled substances? Not that anyone observed. Suffering from any diagnosed mental condition that would impair her judgment? No. Being threatened or coerced in any way? No. If anything, she seemed eager to sign. Then she was in her right mind, Harold. She was just in the wrong relationship. I could hear Harold sighing, the deep, exhausted sigh of a man who'd spent his career cleaning up other people's messes and was getting too old for this particular brand of drama. Adrien, he said, I have to ask, did you plan this? I planned for this, I corrected. There's a difference. I didn't make Elellanar choose Victor Hale. I didn't make her publicly humiliate our marriage. I didn't make her reject the Cross name. I just made sure that if she ever decided to do those things, she'd experience the full consequences of her choices. And those consequences are reality, I said simply. For the first time in her adult life, Elellanar is going to find out who she really is when she's not Mrs. Cross. She's going to discover what her actual market value is without the family name backing her up. She's going to learn what it's like to live without the safety net she's been taking for granted for years. She could end up with nothing. She could end up with exactly what she's worth on her own merits. I corrected. Which might be nothing. But that's between her and the universe. Harold was quiet again, probably running through legal precedents in case law, looking for any angle that might help Elellanar undo what she'd done, but I already knew he wouldn't find anything. Grandpa Edmund had been thorough and Harold himself had updated the clause to close every possible loophole. What should I tell her when she calls back? Harold asked. Tell her the truth. I said. Tell her that actions have consequences. Tell her that legal documents are legal documents. Tell her that when someone asks for exactly what they want, sometimes they get exactly what they deserve. And if she keeps pushing, if she tries to make this into a legal battle, then she'll lose, I said simply. And she'll lose expensively. Because now she'll have to pay for her own lawyers. I hung up the phone and turned back to my quarterly reports, but I couldn't concentrate. Because somewhere across town, Elellanar was sitting in her car, probably staring at her phone, probably crying, probably beginning to understand for the first time in her life that choices have prices and bills eventually come due. And for the first time in years, I felt something I'd almost forgotten existed. Peace. You know what's fascinating about watching a complex system work exactly as it was designed? It's like watching a master chef prepare a soufflé. Everything looks chaotic and random until suddenly it all comes together in perfect, inevitable harmony. Except in this case, instead of eggs and cream, we were working with legal documents and social consequences. And instead of a delicious dessert, Elellanar was getting a masterclass in cause and effect. I spent the next few days doing what I do best, absolutely nothing. Well, not exactly nothing. I went to work, attended meetings, reviewed contracts, made decisions about things that mattered to people who weren't currently discovering that their entire lifestyle had been built on someone else's foundation. But as far as Eleanor's situation was concerned, I was practicing the fine art of strategic inaction. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is absolutely nothing and let the universe handle the heavy lifting. The beauty of Grandpa Edmund's system wasn't just in its comprehensiveness, it was in its automation. Once Eleanor had triggered clause 19.7. The whole thing started running like a Swiss watch that had been wound up and set loose. I didn't have to make phone calls or send emails or issue instructions to anyone. The system simply began updating itself, methodically working through decades of interconnected privileges and access rights, surgically removing Eleanor from every single one. It started small, almost imperceptibly, the kind of changes that most people wouldn't even notice unless they were paying very close attention. Her company credit cards, the ones she used for those little shopping trips that somehow always ended up costing more than a small car, quietly stopped working. Her access to the family's private banking portal, where she'd been able to transfer funds between accounts like she was playing Monopoly, simply vanished overnight. The automatic deposits that had been flowing into her personal account every month like clockwork, rerouted back to the family fund with the efficiency of a well-programmed computer. But the really interesting part wasn't the financial stuff. That was just the obvious, surface-level consequences. The real artistry was in how the social infrastructure began to crumble. Because the Cross family wasn't just wealthy, we were connected. And those connections, it turned out, were all tied to the name Eleanor had just tossed aside like yesterday's newspaper. I found out about the cascade through Janet, who had a remarkable talent for gathering information without ever appearing to be gathering information. She'd mention things casually, like she was commenting on the weather. Oh, by the way, Eleanor tried to make a reservation at Le Bernardin yesterday, and they told her they were booked solid for the next 6 months. Pause. Funny thing is, I called an hour later, and they had a table available tonight. Le Bernardin was one of those restaurants that existed in a parallel universe where normal rules didn't apply. You didn't just call and make a reservation. You had relationships, history, connections that went back years. The Cross family had been dining there since before it was fashionable to care about Michelin stars. But those relationships, it turned out, were with the Cross family, not with Eleanor personally. The pattern repeated itself everywhere. The spa where Eleanor had been getting her weekly treatment suddenly had a waiting list. The boutiques where she'd been a VIP customer were mysteriously unable to accommodate her usual appointments. The charity committees where she'd held positions of influence were politely suggesting that perhaps she might want to step back and focus on her personal transition. It wasn't malicious, at least, not consciously. These people weren't sitting around plotting Eleanor's downfall. They were just responding to subtle but unmistakable signals that Eleanor was no longer operating under the protection of the Cross family umbrella. And in their world, that meant she was no longer operating under any protection at all. The most delicious part was watching how the family's social circle began to react. These were people who had known Eleanor for years, who had attended her dinner parties, who had included her in their conversations and their plans. But now, without the Cross name to anchor her place in their hierarchy, she was starting to drift. Cousin Julia was the first to really notice. Or at least, the first to comment on it publicly. Julia had always been the family's unofficial social coordinator, the one who kept track of who was doing what with whom and made sure everyone stayed properly connected to everyone else. She had a talent for observation that would have made her an excellent detective if she hadn't been born into enough money to make detective work unnecessary. "Have you seen Eleanor lately?" Julia asked me at the monthly family board meeting. She was trying to sound casual, but Julia had never been particularly good at casual. Casual wasn't really her thing. "Not lately, no." I replied, which was technically true. I'd seen Eleanor from a distance a few times, sitting in her car outside Victor's building, standing in line at a coffee shop that definitely wasn't her usual coffee shop, looking increasingly frantic as she tried to figure out why her world had suddenly become so much more complicated. But I hadn't actually seen her up close, and I certainly hadn't spoken to her. "It's just that she missed the Foundation Gala Committee meeting," Julia continued, "and the planning session for the winter charity auction. And Margaret said she called the country club about tennis lessons, and they told her she'd need to reapply for membership." Martin Royce, who managed the family's charitable foundation and had the kind of encyclopedic memory for details that made him invaluable in family discussions, looked up from his notes. "This was the moment I'd been waiting for, not because I wanted to humiliate Eleanor publicly, but because I wanted the family to understand exactly what had happened and why it had happened. The Cross family had survived for 3 generations because we were clear about our boundaries, our expectations, and our consequences. Eleanor had tested those boundaries, and now everyone was going to see what happened when the boundaries pushed back. Eleanor voluntarily renounced the Cross name. I explained calmly. She signed a formal document rejecting any association with the family. The system responded accordingly. The room went quiet in the way that family meetings go quiet when someone has just said something that changes everything. Not shocked quiet. These people had all been at the dinner party. They'd all witnessed Eleanor's little performance. But comprehension quiet, the kind of quiet that happens when puzzle pieces suddenly click into place. You mean she's actually out? Martin asked, completely out. She's exactly as out as she wanted to be. I replied. Julia was staring at me with the kind of expression people get when they realize they've been watching a chess game and suddenly understood that what they thought was a random move was actually checkmate 6 moves ago. Adrien, do you have any idea what this means for her? I have every idea what it means for her, I said. The question is whether she has any idea what it means for her. Over the following days, the reports kept coming in. Eleanor's personal trainer, who had been charging his fees directly to the family wellness account, politely informed her that she'd need to set up her own payment method going forward. The car service she'd been using for years, the one that knew to stock her favorite sparkling water and always took the scenic route when she was feeling chatty, suddenly required a credit card on file and payment in advance. Her dermatologist's office called to inform her that her annual membership in their VIP program had expired and would need to be renewed at full price if she wanted to continue her treatments. The art dealer who had been helping her build her collection, mostly overpriced pieces that she bought because they matched her handbags, mentioned that he was having trouble reaching her bank to process her latest purchase. Each individual incident was small, manageable, the kind of thing that normally would have been handled with a phone call or a quick transfer from one of the family accounts. But taken together, they created a cascade of inconvenience, embarrassment, and growing awareness that the life Eleanor had been living wasn't actually her life. It was the Cross family's life, and she'd been living it on borrowed time. The most telling incident came when she tried to make her usual appointment at the family's private medical clinic. The Cross family had a relationship with some of the best doctors in the city, the kind of concierge medical care that money couldn't actually buy because it wasn't really for sale, it was for family. But when Eleanor called to schedule her routine checkup, she was politely informed that she'd need to register as a new patient and provide her own insurance information. Insurance information, she'd apparently asked, according to Harold, who had fielded another frantic phone call. What insurance information? That's when she discovered that her health coverage had been provided through the Cross family's group policy, and that policy covered family members. Since she was no longer technically a family member, she was no longer technically covered. She'd need to find her own insurance, submit her own claims, pay her own deductibles like some kind of regular person. Phone call to Harold that followed this discovery was by his description memorable. Eleanor had apparently spent 20 minutes explaining in increasingly hysterical terms that she hadn't meant to give up her health insurance when she'd rejected the Cross name. She thought she was making a statement about independence and authenticity, not signing up for the nightmare that is American healthcare. Bureaucracy. What am I supposed to do? She'd asked Harold. I can't just not have health insurance. You could get a job, Harold had suggested, in what I thought was a moment of beautiful clarity. Most jobs provide health insurance. Apparently, Eleanor had not found this suggestion helpful. But the real masterpiece was watching how her social media presence began to shift. Eleanor had always been one of those people who treated Instagram like a personal PR department, carefully curating an image of effortless luxury and tasteful abundance. Her posts were a highlight reel of spa days, shopping trips, charity galas, and vacation destinations that most people could only dream about. Suddenly, the posts became less frequent, less polished, less obviously expensive. Instead of pictures from her usual high-end haunts, she was posting from chain restaurants and shopping malls. Instead of designer outfits, she was wearing things that looked suspiciously like they might have come from actual stores where normal people shopped. Her captions, which had always been carefully crafted to project confidence and sophistication, became increasingly defensive and erratic. The comments section told the Royale story. People who had been liking and fawning over her posts for years were suddenly quiet. The social media ecosystem that had fed her ego and validated her lifestyle was running on the same principles as everything else. It was responding to signals about status, access, and relevance. And all of those signals were telling the same story. Eleanor was no longer Mrs. Cross. She was just Eleanor, whoever that turned out to be. And the world was responding accordingly. You know what's beautiful about watching someone celebrate prematurely? It's like watching a person do a victory dance on what they think is solid ground, not realizing they're actually standing on a trapdoor. Victor Hale was doing the most elaborate victory dance I'd ever seen, complete with social media choreography and a soundtrack of smug self-congratulation that was absolutely music to my ears. The guy had taken Eleanor's public rejection of the Cross name and turned it into his personal brand moment. Because of course he had. Victor was exactly the kind of person who would turn someone else's family drama into content for his LinkedIn profile. I'd been watching his social media presence with the kind of fascination usually reserved for nature documentaries about predators. Equal parts horror and admiration for the pure, unfiltered audacity of it all. His Instagram had become a shrine to what he apparently considered his greatest conquest. There was Elellanar, draped over him like a human accessory, both of them grinning with the kind of aggressive happiness that screamed, "Look how much better we are than everyone else." The captions were masterpieces of barely disguised arrogance wrapped in the language of authentic love and personal growth. Real love means choosing the person, not the name. Read one post, featuring a picture of them at some trendy restaurant that probably charged $40 for avocado toast. When you find someone brave enough to leave everything behind for authentic connection, you know you've found something special. #authentic love #real recognizestrial #new beginnings. I had to give Victor credit. He understood his audience. The post had hundreds of likes and comments from people who ate this kind of performative romance up like it was gourmet chocolate. So inspiring. True love conquers all. You guys are relationship goals. The whole thing was like watching a master class in manipulating people who confused Instagram captions with actual wisdom. But the real masterpiece was the video he'd posted just 2 days after Ellanar's dinner party announcement. It was one of those professionally casual videos that tech brothers love, shot in what was obviously his expensive apartment, with carefully arranged books and motivational posters in the background, him wearing a hoodie that probably cost more than most people's rent. "I want to talk about courage," Victor began, looking directly into the camera with the kind of intense sincerity that would have been impressive if it wasn't so obviously rehearsed. About what it means to choose love over legacy, authenticity over expectation, real connection over inherited privilege. He went on for 7 minutes, about how Ellanar's decision to reject the cross name was the most courageous act of self-determination he'd ever witnessed. He talked about breaking free from toxic family dynamics and choosing your own path and not letting other people's money define your worth. The whole thing was dripping with the kind of pseudo-philosophical nonsense that people who read too many self-help books and think they're enlightened love to consume. "Elellanar didn't just choose me," Victor said, staring into the camera like he was delivering the Gettysburg Address. "She chose herself. She chose freedom. She chose to be the author of her own story instead of just a character in someone else's legacy." The comments section was a love fest of people praising Victor's wisdom and Ellanar's bravery. Apparently, publicly humiliating your husband at a family dinner was now considered a form of feminist empowerment. Who knew? But my favorite part, the part that made me actually laugh out loud in my office, was when Victor started dropping hints about their future together. "Big announcements coming soon," he teased in one post. "When you know, you know. Some things are worth making official. #stay tuned #new chapter #real recognize real." The guy was actually planning to propose. Not only had he convinced Elellanar to blow up her marriage and forfeit her entire lifestyle, but he was preparing to make it permanent. It was like watching someone not only step on a landmine but then decide to do a little tap dance on it to make sure it was fully activated. What made it even more delicious was watching Elellanar lean into the narrative. She was retweeting Victor's posts, sharing his videos, adding her own commentary about finding her authentic self and discovering what real love looks like. She was treating their relationship like a social media campaign, complete with hashtags and branded messaging. "Never felt more myself than I do right now," she posted, along with a picture of them at what looked like a farmer's market, both of them holding organic vegetables like they were trophies. When you stop living someone else's version of your life, and start living your own truth, everything becomes possible. "Grateful for this man who saw me for who I really am, not just what name I carried." The irony was so thick you could have cut it with a knife and served it at a dinner party. Elellanar was posting about authenticity and being seen for who she really was, while apparently being completely blind to the fact that who she really was without the cross name was someone who couldn't afford organic vegetables at a farmer's market without checking her bank balance first. But Victor was eating it up. He was reposting her content, adding his own commentary, building their relationship into this narrative about triumph over adversity and love conquering all. He was turning Ellanar's family drama into his origin story, positioning himself as the hero who'd rescued the princess from the tower of inherited privilege. "Watch two people choose love over everything." He captioned a video of them walking hand in hand through some park. The camera work so carefully orchestrated it looked like a commercial for engagement rings. When society tells you to stay in your lane, sometimes the most radical thing you can do is change lanes entirely. The best part was that Victor genuinely seemed to believe his own narrative. He wasn't just performing for his audience. He was performing for himself, convincing himself that he was some kind of romantic revolutionary who'd liberated Elellanar from the oppressive burden of wealth and privilege. The guy had somehow convinced himself that dating a woman who'd just voluntarily given up access to generational wealth was actually a smart strategic move. Meanwhile, I was sitting in my office, watching this whole performance play out, and quietly building a file. Not because I was planning some kind of elaborate revenge. I'm not that petty. Well, okay, I am that petty, but I'm also practical. I was documenting everything because Victor's social media celebration was providing the most perfect, unambiguous evidence of voluntary renunciation anyone could have asked for. Every post, every video, every carefully crafted caption was proof that Elellanar hadn't been coerced or manipulated or forced into rejecting the cross name. She'd done it willingly, enthusiastically, publicly, and with the full support and encouragement of her new boyfriend, who was treating it like the greatest victory of his career. Harold was going to love this. If Elellanar ever tried to contest what she'd signed, if she ever claimed she'd been under duress or hadn't understood what she was doing, we'd have hundreds of pieces of social media evidence showing that not only had she understood exactly what she was doing, but she'd been proud of it. She'd been celebrating it. She'd been building her entire new identity around it. Victor was basically creating a digital paper trail that proved Elellanar had rejected the cross name voluntarily, enthusiastically, and with full knowledge of what it meant. He was so busy celebrating his victory that he was documenting his girlfriend's legal suicide, one Instagram post at a time. And the beautiful thing was that he had no idea. None of them did. They were so caught up in their narrative of authentic love and personal liberation that they couldn't see the forest for the trees. They thought they were writing a love story, when what they were actually writing was evidence for a legal case that Elellanar would never be able to win. Sometimes the best strategy isn't to defeat your enemies. It's to let them defeat themselves while thinking they're winning. You know what's funny about people who think they can have their cake and eat it too? They never stop to consider that someone else might have actually paid for the cake. And the plate it's sitting on. And the house where the kitchen is located. Elellanar was about to get a lesson in property ownership that probably should have been covered in whatever fancy private school she went to. But apparently, they were too busy teaching her how to look good at charity galas to explain the basics of real estate law. It was a Tuesday afternoon when Elellanar decided to grace the Cross mansion with her presence. I knew because Mrs. Henderson, our longtime housekeeper who had perfected the art of knowing everything while appearing to know nothing, mentioned it casually while bringing me my coffee. Mrs. Cross. Excuse me, Ms. whatever her name is now, tried to come by today, she said in that carefully neutral tone that somehow managed to convey volumes about what she really thought of the situation. I'd been expecting this. Eventually, Elellanar was going to realize that rejecting the cross name was one thing, but actually living without access to cross property was something else entirely. She'd probably started running low on clothes, or maybe she'd decided she wanted some specific piece of jewelry, or perhaps she'd simply gotten nostalgic for the life she'd tossed aside like yesterday's newspaper. The security system at the mansion was one of those things that most people took for granted until it suddenly became extremely relevant to their daily lives. It wasn't just electronic locks and cameras. It was a comprehensive access control system that managed everything from the main gates to the garage doors to the individual room codes. And it was all tied to the Cross family database, which meant that when Ellanar's status changed, everything changed. I'd had her access codes updated the day after she signed the document. Not out of spite, though I'll admit there was a certain poetic justice to it, but out of simple practicality. The woman had just publicly declared that she wanted nothing to do with the Cross name or the Cross family. It seemed reasonable to take her at her word and adjust her access accordingly. The main gate system was particularly elegant in its simplicity. It recognized family members through a combination of codes, biometric data, and vehicle registration. Ellanar's Mercedes, which had been registered under the Cross family insurance and financing, was still in the system, but her personal access codes had been deactivated. So when she pulled up to the gate and tried her usual combination, nothing happened. The gate remained closed, polite but firm in its refusal to acknowledge her authority. I could picture her sitting there in her car, probably hitting the code buttons harder each time, convinced that it was some kind of technical malfunction. Elellanar had never been particularly good with technology that didn't immediately bend to her will. She was the kind of person who would reboot her computer 17 times before admitting that maybe the problem wasn't the machine. Mrs. Henderson, who had been watching from the kitchen window with the kind of professional curiosity that comes from 40 years of managing wealthy people's domestic drama, reported that Elellanar had tried the service entrance next. This showed a surprising level of determination, considering that Elellanar usually acted like the service areas of the house were some kind of foreign territory that required a passport to visit. But the service entrance was on the same system as everything else. Grandpa Edmund had been thorough about security, probably because he'd lived through enough historical unpleasantness to understand that wealthy families needed to be careful about who they let onto their property. The system wasn't designed to make exceptions based on hurt feelings or romantic complications. After about 20 minutes of various unsuccessful attempts to gain entry, Elellanar had apparently gotten out of her car and started walking the perimeter of the property, looking for some other way in. Mrs. Henderson described it as pathetic, really, which was about as harsh as Mrs. Henderson ever got in her professional assessments. That's when Mrs. Patterson from next door had gotten involved. Mrs. Patterson was one of those neighbors who had nothing better to do than monitor everyone else's business, which made her simultaneously annoying and occasionally useful. She'd apparently approached Eleanor at the gate with the kind of fake concern that neighborhood busybodies specialize in. "Eleanor, dear," Mrs. Patterson had said, according to Mrs. Henderson's account. "Are you locked out? That's so unfortunate. Adrien moved most of your belongings into storage last week. He mentioned something about privacy mattering during difficult transitions." The beauty of this statement was its perfect ambiguity. Mrs. Patterson was technically just sharing information. But the subtext was clear. Eleanor was no longer welcome here, everyone knew it, and Adrien had already taken steps to formalize the separation. It was the kind of polite social assassination that wealthy neighborhoods specialized in. Eleanor's reaction, as described by both Mrs. Henderson and Mrs. Patterson, who had clearly enjoyed every moment of the encounter, was a progression through the 5 stages of grief compressed into about 30 seconds. Denial, there must be some mistake. Anger, this is ridiculous, I live here. Bargaining, can you call Adrien for me? Depression, sitting on the hood of her car looking defeated, and finally acceptance, or at least resignation, as she got back in her Mercedes and drove away. I was in my study when all this was happening, reading quarterly reports and listening to the faint sound of Eleanor's voice gradually fading into the distance. I hadn't locked her out of cruelty or revenge. I'd simply acknowledged the reality that she'd created with her own signature. She'd chosen to reject the cross name, and property access was tied to the cross name. It was basic logic, elegant in its simplicity. The mansion felt different after she left. Quieter, but not empty. More like it had finally exhaled after holding its breath for a very long time. Mrs. Henderson continued her work with the kind of professional discretion that made her invaluable, and I continued mine with the satisfaction of knowing that boundaries, once established, were being respected. Eleanor had wanted freedom from the cross name. Now she was learning what that freedom actually cost. You know what they say about karma. It doesn't just come back to bite you. It comes back with a law degree and a formal delivery service. 3 weeks after Eleanor's little gate-rattling adventure at the mansion, the Cross Family Foundation's annual charity gala rolled around like clockwork, bringing with it all the pomp, circumstance, and carefully orchestrated social warfare that made these events so deliciously entertaining for people with functioning survival instincts. The Ashford Hotel ballroom was its usual spectacular self. Crystal chandeliers throwing rainbows across marble floors, flower arrangements that probably cost more than most people's cars, and enough black tie sophistication to make a James Bond movie look casual. These galas were where Manhattan's old money families came to see and be seen, to make donations that would get their names engraved on plaques, and to engage in the kind of subtle social positioning that would make corporate politics look like kindergarten recess. Eleanor showed up fashionably late, which was standard operating procedure for her at these things. She'd always treated charity galas like her personal runway shows, timing her entrance for maximum impact. Tonight was no different, except for the small detail that she was no longer operating under the protective umbrella of the Cross family name. She was just another attendee now, albeit one with a spectacular talent for not reading the room. She'd brought Victor as her date, naturally, because nothing says, "I've moved on with my life," like showing up to your former family's charity event with the guy you left your husband for. Victor was wearing a tuxedo that looked like it had been assembled by someone who'd learned about formal wear from Google image searches. Technically correct, but missing some indefinable quality that separated people who belonged at these events from people who were just visiting. I watched them work the room for about 20 minutes, noting how conversations seemed to end just a little too quickly, how groups had a tendency to disperse shortly after Eleanor and Victor joined them. It was an obvious rejection. These people were far too well-bred for anything that crude. It was more like social friction, the kind of polite resistance that meant you were welcome to be here, but you weren't really welcome to stay here. That's when James Morrison, our family's legal representative for formal occasions, approached Eleanor with the kind of purposeful stride that meant business was about to be conducted whether the recipient wanted it or not. James was one of those lawyers who looked like he'd been born wearing a 3-piece suit, the kind of man who could deliver devastating news with the same pleasant expression he'd used to comment on the weather. The envelope he carried was cream-colored, heavy stock, with the Cross family crest embossed in gold. It looked expensive, official, and ominous. Exactly the kind of document that made smart people very nervous and made Eleanor apparently very curious. She accepted it with a smile, probably thinking it was some kind of invitation or acknowledgement, maybe even an olive branch for me. The ballroom's ambient noise level seemed to drop by about half as Eleanor opened the envelope and began reading its contents. I couldn't hear what she was saying from across the room, but her facial expression told the whole story in real time. Confusion, followed by comprehension, followed by the kind of pale shock that usually requires medical attention. The document was comprehensive, professionally prepared, and absolutely devastating in its thoroughness. Property access rights, revoked. Inheritance claims, severed. Trust fund distributions, terminated. Family Foundation Board position, eliminated. Healthcare coverage, discontinued. Even burial rights in the Cross family mausoleum, officially forfeited. At the bottom, in the Cross family mausoleum, officially forfeited. At the bottom, in my own handwriting, was a note that James had helped me craft for maximum impact: blood matters. But names carry the weight. You gave yours away. The crowd's reaction was everything I could have hoped for and more. These people were connoisseurs of social drama, experts in reading between the lines of public interactions. They understood immediately that they were witnessing something significant, not just a divorce, but a complete excommunication from one of their most established families. Eleanor's face went through more color changes than a mood ring in a fever dream. Victor, standing beside her with his perfect teeth and his perfectly styled hair, was clearly trying to figure out whether he should comfort her, defend her, or just pretend he didn't know her. The man looked like he was calculating the social cost of his association with Eleanor in real time and finding the numbers deeply concerning. The whispers started immediately, spreading through the ballroom like ripples in a pond. Did you see what she just received? Is that what I think it is? My God, they've actually cut her off completely. I told you this would happen. She brought this on herself. Some of Eleanor's former friends, and I use the term friends in the loosest possible sense, took a step back, literally and figuratively distancing themselves from someone who had just been publicly declared persona non grata by one of the city's most powerful families. Others watched with the kind of fascinated horror usually reserved for natural disasters and reality television shows. Victor tried to rally, putting his arm around Eleanor's shoulders and saying something that was probably meant to be supportive but came out sounding defensive. He was discovering in real time that being someone's romantic savior was a lot more complicated when that someone had just been formally exiled from the social circle you were trying to join. Eleanor herself seemed to be having trouble processing what had just happened. She kept looking at the document, then at me, then at the crowd around her, as if she was waiting for someone to explain that this was all just an elaborate joke. But the joke, if it was a joke, was on her. The most beautiful part was watching how the charity auction continued around them, as if nothing had happened. The auctioneer kept taking bids, people kept chatting about their vacation plans, the waiters kept serving champagne. Eleanor's personal crisis was just background noise to an event that had bigger things to worry about than one woman's poor life choices. As the evening progressed, Eleanor and Victor found themselves increasingly isolated, standing in their little bubble of social rejection while the rest of the gala flowed around them like water around a stone. They left early, which was probably the smartest decision Eleanor had made in months. The name cross would endure. Eleanor's association with it would not. You know what's fascinating about social death? It's not like physical death, where there's a definitive moment when everything stops. Social death is more like watching a tide go out, slow, inevitable, and absolutely merciless in its thoroughness. One day you're standing on solid ground, and the next day you're looking around wondering where all the water went and why you're suddenly standing alone on a bunch of wet sand that used to be your life. Eleanor's exile wasn't announced with trumpets or formal declarations. Nobody sent out memos explaining that she was now off limits, and there weren't any official blacklists circulated among Manhattan's social elite. The whole thing was much more elegant than that, operating on the kind of subtle social frequencies that people like Eleanor had never learned to detect because she'd never needed to worry about them before. It started with the phone calls that stopped coming. Eleanor had always been the kind of person whose calendar was booked solid with lunch dates, shopping expeditions, committee meetings, and social obligations that kept her busy enough to feel important. Her phone used to buzz constantly with invitations, updates, gossip, and the general social chatter that filled the days of people who didn't have to work for their entertainment budget. Now, her phone was developing an alarming tendency toward silence. Not complete silence. Victor still called, and there were still the occasional telemarketers and appointment confirmations that proved the device was technically functioning. But the steady stream of social communication that had been the soundtrack to her life for years had slowed to a trickle, then dried up almost entirely. Julia Cross, who had been Eleanor's primary connection to the family's social network, stopped calling first. Julia was smart enough to recognize which way the wind was blowing, and she'd always been more loyal to the Cross name than to any individual Cross family member. When Eleanor tried calling her back, Julia was always just heading into a meeting, or just about to leave for an appointment, or dealing with some family emergency that required her immediate attention. The pattern repeated itself across Ellanar's entire social circle. Margaret Ashford, who had been Ellanar's partner in organizing charity events for 3 years, suddenly found herself too busy to return calls. Patricia Whitmore, who had been Ellanar's regular tennis partner at the country club, discovered a newfound passion for solo practice sessions. Even Caroline Fletcher, who had never missed an opportunity to gossip about other people's personal drama, seemed to have developed a mysterious case of selective hearing whenever Ellanar's name came up. Social media told the story even more clearly than phone records. Ellanar's Instagram posts, which had once generated dozens of likes and comments from her social circle, were now echoing in a digital void. The same people who used to respond to her every vacation photo and restaurant check-in were now scrolling past her content like it was sponsored advertising for something they weren't interested in buying. Her follower count started dropping, not dramatically, but steadily, like a slow leak in a tire. People weren't unfollowing her in angry protest. They were just quietly removing themselves from her digital orbit, the same way they were removing themselves from her actual orbit. It was social decluttering, the kind of maintenance people do when they're trying to keep their feeds relevant to their actual lives. The charity committees were the next domino to fall. Elellanar had held positions on half a dozen different boards, mostly honorary roles that involved showing up to meetings, writing checks, and lending her name to fundraising efforts. These positions had been part of her identity, the way she defined herself in conversations with strangers. "I'm on the board of the Children's Hospital," she'd say. Or "I chair the Literacy Foundation's annual gala." One by one, those positions evaporated. Not through dramatic confrontations or angry resignations, but through the kind of polite, bureaucratic machinery that makes problems disappear without creating scenes. Her term on the hospital board concluded a year early due to restructuring. The Literacy Foundation regretfully informed her that they were streamlining their leadership structure and would no longer require her services. The Art Museum thanked her for her past contributions and wished her well in her future endeavors. Victor, meanwhile, was discovering that his association with Elellanar was affecting his own social standing in ways he hadn't anticipated. The tech world he came from operated on different rules, where disruption was celebrated and breaking things was considered innovative. But old money social circles had their own immune system, and Victor was learning that being seen as a disruptor wasn't necessarily an asset when you were trying to join an establishment that valued stability above all else. His invitations to exclusive events started becoming less exclusive and less frequent. The venture capital networking dinners that had been so eager to include him when he was a successful bachelor were suddenly booked solid whenever his assistant called to RSVP for two. The private investment opportunities that had been flowing his way slowed to a trickle as word spread that he'd chosen personal drama over professional discretion. Victor tried to compensate by throwing his own events, hosting dinners and parties designed to create his own social network with Elellanar at the center. But building a social circle from scratch is like trying to create an ecosystem in a petri dish. It requires more than just resources and good intentions. The people who showed up to Victor's events were mostly other tech industry figures and social climbers who were more interested in Victor's bank account than his girlfriend's pedigree. Elellanar found herself in the strange position of being the center of attention at parties where nobody really mattered, at least not by the standards she'd grown accustomed to. These were people who were impressed by the fact that she'd been married to Adrien Cross, not people who had known her when she was married to Adrien Cross. They treated her like a celebrity rather than a peer, which would have been flattering if she hadn't spent years taking actual peer recognition for granted. The most devastating blow came when Elellanar tried to organize her own charity event, a literacy fundraiser that she'd been planning for months before her life imploded. She'd assumed that her contacts, her reputation, and her organizational skills would be enough to pull together a successful gala even without the official backing of the Cross family name. She was wrong. The venue that had verbally committed to hosting the event suddenly discovered scheduling conflicts. The caterer who had been eager to work with her found unexpected capacity limitations. The auction house that had promised to donate services for the fundraising auction decided to focus their charitable contributions on established organizations with proven track records. Most painfully, the donors who had been reliable supporters of her previous efforts were nowhere to be found. Phone calls went unreturned, emails disappeared into digital voids, and the few people who did respond offered polite expressions of support that came with no actual financial commitments. Elellanar was forced to cancel the event 3 weeks before it was scheduled to happen, sending out embarrassed notifications to the handful of people who had actually committed to attending. The failure was public, humiliating, and absolute. A perfect demonstration of the difference between having influence and merely being associated with influence. Through all of this, I maintained my strategic silence. I didn't need to actively exclude Elellanar from anything because she was excluding herself through the simple act of no longer being Elellanar Cross. The social infrastructure that had supported her for years hadn't been built around her personality or her individual merits, it had been built around her connection to the Cross family. And when that connection was severed, the infrastructure naturally adjusted to reflect the new reality. Eleanor thought she had been the center of her social universe, but she'd actually been more like a moon. Visible, notable, but ultimately dependent on a larger gravitational force for her position and influence. When she chose to break orbit, she didn't become a star. She just drifted off into empty space, wondering why the view had suddenly become so cold and dark. The beauty of it was that I didn't have to be the villain in this story. I was just the gravitational force that Eleanor had chosen to escape. The beauty of it was that I didn't have to be the villain in this story. I was just the gravitational force that Eleanor had chosen to escape. The exile was entirely of her own making, a natural consequence of choices she'd made freely and publicly. She'd wanted independence, and independence was exactly what she'd gotten. She just hadn't realized that independence meant being alone. You know what's funny about rock bottom? Most people think it's a destination, a place you arrive at after a long fall. But rock bottom is actually more like quicksand. The harder you struggle against it, the deeper you sink, until eventually you realize that the only way out is to stop fighting and start thinking. Eleanor had been fighting for weeks, and she was finally ready to try thinking, which was why she tracked me down at the Ashton Botanical Reserve on a Thursday afternoon that felt more like a confessional than a chance encounter. I'd been volunteering at the reserve for about 5 years, ever since I'd realized that having too much money and not enough purpose was a recipe for the kind of existential boredom that drove wealthy men to buy sports cars and trophy wives. The Botanical Reserve was my antidote to irrelevance. 2 hours every Thursday afternoon spent doing actual work with my actual hands, pruning roses and maintaining flower beds like some kind of millionaire groundskeeper. It was honest work, the kind that produced visible results and required no committee meetings, no board approvals, no corporate politics. You planted something, you watered it, you pruned it when it needed pruning, and if you did everything right, it grew into something beautiful. There was something deeply satisfying about that level of straightforward cause and effect, especially after spending most of my professional life navigating the Byzantine complexities of family business and social obligations. The rose garden was my particular specialty, mostly because roses required the kind of attention to detail and long-term planning that appealed to my personality. You couldn't rush a rose garden, couldn't force it to bloom on your schedule, couldn't fix it with money or connections or family influence. Roses responded to patience, consistency, and the willingness to do the unglamorous work of maintenance when nobody was watching. I was working on a particularly stubborn climbing rose that had developed some kind of fungal issue when I heard footsteps on the gravel path behind me. I didn't turn around immediately. The reserve attracted all kinds of visitors, and I'd learned to tune out the casual foot traffic that wandered through the gardens taking selfies and commenting on the pretty flowers. But these footsteps had a hesitant quality, the sound of someone who wasn't sure they belonged where they were walking. Adrien. Eleanor's voice was smaller than I remembered, less certain, stripped of the performative confidence she'd been wearing like armor for months. I continued working on the rose, carefully removing the affected leaves and disposing of them in my waste bag. Fungal infections spread quickly if you weren't diligent about containment, and I'd learned that prevention was always easier than treatment. Adrien, please. I know you can hear me. I finished examining the branch I was working on, made one more careful cut, then finally turned to face her. Eleanor looked like she'd been living in her car for a week, which, given her recent financial situation, she might have been. Her usually perfect hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail. Her makeup was either non-existent or had been applied by someone who'd forgotten how to use a mirror, and she was wearing clothes that looked suspiciously like they might have come from an actual store where normal people shopped. Eleanor, I said, acknowledging her presence with about as much enthusiasm as I'd show for a parking ticket. This is unexpected. I've been looking for you, she said, which raised some interesting questions about how long she'd been stalking me and whether I needed to call security. You don't answer your phone. Your office won't take my calls. The house. She trailed off, probably remembering her recent adventure with the gate codes. I've been busy, I said, which was true. Between running cross industries, managing family investments, and maintaining my sanity after my wife's very public nervous breakdown, I'd had plenty to occupy my time. Eleanor stepped closer, and I could see that she'd been crying recently. Not the elegant, single-tear kind of crying that looked good in movies, but the red-eyed, puffy-faced kind of crying that happened when reality finally caught up with your delusions and introduced itself with a baseball bat. Adrien, I need to talk to you, she said. Really talk? About what happened? About what I did? I turned back to the roses, partially because they needed attention and partially because looking at Eleanor was like looking at a car accident. Tragic, unavoidable, but ultimately something you couldn't fix by staring at it. I'm listening, I said, though I kept working while she talked. Multitasking seemed appropriate for this conversation. I didn't think it would mean all this, Elellanar said, her voice carrying the kind of desperate sincerity that people develop when they're trying to convince themselves as much as anyone else. When I signed that paper, I thought it was just symbolic, like a gesture. I didn't realize it would actually change anything. I found a particularly diseased section of stem and cut it cleanly, dropping the infected material into my disposal bag. What did you think it would change? Nothing. Elellanar said, her voice rising with something that might have been panic. I thought it would make a point. I thought it would show everyone that I was strong enough to choose my own path. I thought. She paused, probably realizing how ridiculous she was about to sound. I thought you'd try to stop me. Why would I try to stop you from getting exactly what you wanted? Because you loved me, Elellanar said, and there was something almost accusatory in her tone, like my failure to fight for our marriage was somehow my fault rather than a reasonable response to her very public rejection of everything we'd built together. I continued pruning, making careful cuts and examining each branch for signs of disease or damage. I did love you, I said calmly. Past tense. But love doesn't mean ignoring reality. And the reality is that you chose Victor Hale over me. You chose his vision of your future over our shared past. You chose rebellion over responsibility. Your future over our shared past. You chose rebellion over responsibility. It wasn't supposed to be permanent, Elellanar said, and now she was definitely crying again. It was supposed to be, I don't know, a wake-up call. A way to get your attention. A way to make you realize that you were taking me for granted. I stopped working and looked at her directly for the first time since she'd arrived. Elellanar, I never took you for granted. I took you seriously. When you said you wanted out, I believed you meant it. But I didn't mean all of it, she said, gesturing vaguely in the direction of what I assumed was her current life situation. I didn't mean the money and the house and the health insurance and all of the infrastructure. I just meant the emotional stuff. The marriage stuff. The emotional stuff and the infrastructure were the infrastructure. I just meant the emotional stuff. The marriage stuff. The emotional stuff and the infrastructure were the same thing. I explained patiently, the way you'd explain basic physics to someone who'd just discovered gravity. They weren't separate systems, Elellanar. They were all part of being married to me, being part of the Cross family, carrying the Cross name. You can't keep the benefits while rejecting the foundation they're built on. Elellanar was quiet for a moment, probably trying to process the concept that actions have consequences and contracts mean what they say rather than what you hope they might mean in retrospect. I can fix this, she said finally, with the kind of desperate optimism that people develop when they're drowning and someone throws them an anchor. Legally, I can reverse it. I can reclaim the name. I can sign whatever documents you want me to sign. I turned back to the roses, found another section that needed attention, and made a clean cut. It's not about paper, Elellanar. It's not about legal documents or signatures or what you can or can't reverse. Then what is it about? It's about meaning, I said simply. And what you meant was loud and clear. You meant that the Cross name wasn't worth keeping. You meant that our marriage wasn't worth preserving. You meant that Victor Hale's opinion of your life choices was more important than mine. But I was wrong. Elellanar said, her voice breaking completely now. I was stupid and selfish and wrong about everything. Maybe, I agreed. But being wrong doesn't undo the consequences of being wrong. It just means you've learned something. I finished examining the rose bush I'd been working on, gathered my tools, and prepared to move on to the next section of the garden. Elellanar was still standing there, looking lost and desperate and completely out of place among the carefully maintained beauty of the Botanical Reserve. Adrien, please, she said one more time. There has to be something, some way to fix this. I looked at her one last time. This woman who had shared my bed and my life and my name for years, who had thrown it all away for a tech bro with expensive teeth and a limited understanding of consequences. The roses here require constant care, I said. Attention, patience, the right conditions. When they're healthy, they're beautiful. But when they get diseased, when they start affecting the other plants around them, sometimes the only way to save the garden is to remove the infected parts. I walked away, leaving Elellanar standing among the roses, finally understanding that some things, once cut away, couldn't be grafted back on. Some mistakes were permanent. Some choices couldn't be undone. And some people discovered too late that they'd never had roots of their own. You know what's beautiful about closure? It's not the dramatic, Hollywood-style resolution where everyone learns important lessons and grows as human beings. Real closure is quieter than that, more practical. It's the moment when you stop looking backward and start building forward, when you realize that the story you've been telling yourself about your life needs a new chapter and you're the only one who can write it. The Cross Family Board meeting was scheduled for the first Tuesday of the month, same as it had been for the past 15 years. Same mahogany conference table that Grandpa Edmund had commissioned in 1952, same leather chairs that had probably witnessed more family drama than a reality TV show, same portraits of dead relatives staring down at us with expressions that suggested they'd seen all this before and weren't particularly impressed by our latest installment. Eleanor's chair sat empty at the far end of the table, positioned where it had always been positioned, exactly as if she might walk through the door at any moment and resume her place in the family hierarchy. Except she wouldn't, and everyone in the room knew it, and the empty chair had become less a symbol of absence and more a symbol of choice. Her choice, made freely and publicly and irrevocably. I'd arrived early, partly because I liked the quiet efficiency of being prepared, and partly because I wanted to watch how the family reacted to that empty chair. People reveal a lot about themselves in the moments when they think nobody's paying attention, and I'd learned over the years that family meetings were excellent opportunities for anthropological observation. Julia Cross was the first to arrive, punctual as always, wearing the kind of understated elegance that came from having enough money to buy anything but enough taste to choose carefully. She glanced at Eleanor's empty chair, paused for exactly 2 seconds, then took her own seat and opened her portfolio as if nothing had changed. Julia had always been good at adapting to new realities, which was why she'd survived 3 decades of cross-family politics without developing an ulcer or a drinking problem. Martin Royce came in next, carrying his usual collection of folders, charts, and documents that made him look like a mobile filing cabinet. Martin managed our charitable foundation with the kind of meticulous attention to detail that would have made him an excellent accountant if he hadn't been born wealthy enough to make accounting unnecessary. He nodded at Eleanor's empty chair the way you'd acknowledge a piece of furniture that used to be useful but wasn't anymore. The other board members filed in over the next few minutes. Cousins, aunts, uncles, and family friends who had earned their seats through various combinations of blood relation, business acumen, and the ability to sit through monthly meetings without causing scenes. They all noticed the empty chair, but nobody commented on it. In wealthy families, you learn early that some subjects are better left undiscussed until someone with authority decides it's time to discuss them. I called the meeting to order with the usual formalities, reviewing the previous month's minutes, and walking through the financial reports that showed our various investments continuing to generate the kind of returns that kept the Cross family comfortable and relevant. We discussed the quarterly dividend distributions, approved some charitable giving allocations, and handled the routine business that kept our family machinery running smoothly. It was all perfectly normal, perfectly functional, perfectly devoid of drama, which made it the perfect moment to introduce something that wasn't routine at all. Before we adjourn, I said, setting down my quarterly report and reaching for a different folder, I'd like to discuss a new initiative. The room went quiet in the way that boardrooms go quiet when someone's about to announce either very good news or very bad news, and nobody's sure which it's going to be. I'd learned over the years that the Cross family had a healthy respect for new initiatives, mostly because our previous new initiatives had tended to work out well for everyone involved. I'm proposing the establishment of the Cross Heritage Endowment, I continued, opening my folder and distributing copies of the proposal I'd been working on for the past month. A scholarship and mentorship program designed to support descendants and chosen family members who honor and maintain the Cross name. Julia looked up from her copy with the kind of expression that meant she was already 3 steps ahead of me and liked where this was going. Define chosen family members, she said. People who earn the right to be considered family through their actions, their values, and their commitment to the principles that the Cross name represents, I explained. Marriage into the family would qualify, obviously, but so would other forms of meaningful, long-term association with our values and our legacy. Martin was scanning through the financial projections, probably calculating the tax implications and endowment requirements in his head. What about people who choose to leave the family, he asked. People who reject the name? They wouldn't be eligible, I said simply. The endowment is specifically designed to reward people who want to be part of the Cross legacy, not people who want to distance themselves from it. The room was quiet for a moment as everyone processed the implications of what I was proposing. It wasn't just a scholarship program. It was a formal recognition that the Cross family was more than just blood relations, that it was an institution with values and standards that could be earned and lost based on behavior rather than genetics. It's brilliant, Julia said finally. It creates incentives for people to honor the family name instead of taking it for granted. And it makes clear that being a Cross is about more than just being born into the right family, added Uncle Charles, who had always been the philosopher of our little group. It's about choosing to embody what the family represents. We spent the next hour working through the details, funding mechanisms, selection criteria, governance structure, all the practical considerations that turn good ideas into functioning programs. The endowment would start with a $10 million foundation grant. Enough to support significant scholarships and create a meaningful incentive for people to earn and maintain their association with the Cross name. But the real beauty of the program wasn't in the money, it was in the message. We were creating a formal mechanism for recognizing that the Cross family was an institution worth joining, worth maintaining, worth protecting. And by extension, we were making it clear that people who chose to reject that institution were making a meaningful choice with meaningful consequences. After the meeting ended and the board members had filed out, I remained in the conference room, sitting alone with the quarterly reports and the empty chair and the satisfaction of knowing that the Cross family would endure long after the current generation had passed on to whatever comes next. Later that evening, I sat in my study with the final draft of the Cross Heritage Endowment Charter, a document that would outlive me and probably outlive my children, if I ever had any. The language was precise, comprehensive, and absolutely clear about what it meant to be worthy of the Cross name. At the bottom of the final page, I added a handwritten note that would become part of the permanent record: a name is not given, it is earned and kept. Eleanor's name would remain in our family archives, of course. You couldn't erase history, and there was no point in trying. But her entry would now carry an asterisk, a small notation that explained her status: voluntary renunciation of family name and associated privileges, effective date. She'd become a cautionary tale, a reminder that the Cross name came with both privileges and responsibilities, and that people who wanted the privileges without the responsibilities would eventually discover that they couldn't have either. I signed the charter with the same pen I'd used to present Eleanor with her divorce papers, filed it in the family safe next to Grandpa Edmund's original documents, and poured myself a glass of the Macallan 25 that Eleanor had always said was too expensive for casual drinking. Tonight felt like the right occasion for expensive Scotch. Tonight felt like the kind of night that deserved a toast. To the Cross family legacy, which had survived wars, depressions, personal tragedies, and Eleanor's particular brand of self-destructive rebellion, to Grandpa Edmund's wisdom in building systems that could protect the family from its own weaknesses, to the understanding that some things, names, reputations, legacies, were worth more than any individual person's temporary happiness, and to the peace that comes from knowing that sometimes, the best way to preserve what matters is to let go of what doesn't. Eleanor had taught me that lesson, though probably not in the way she'd intended. She'd shown me the difference between being married to someone and being committed to something larger than yourself. She'd demonstrated that love without respect was just expensive entertainment, and that loyalty without shared respect was just expensive entertainment, and that loyalty without shared values was just codependency with better furniture. Most importantly, she'd reminded me that the Cross family had survived for 3 generations not because we were perfect, but because we understood that institutions were more important than individuals, that legacy was more valuable than immediate gratification, and that some choices, once made, couldn't be unmade. The family name would endure. The family values would continue. The family legacy would grow stronger. And Eleanor Cross, former Eleanor Cross, would find her own way in a world where actions had consequences and names actually meant something. It was, all things considered, exactly the ending that everyone deserved.